As 6 Hanford workers rolled into the ER in the last 3 weeks, sick after inhaling unknown vapors, and 20 more off to a doctor, their employer sent out public statements. The government contractor, Washington River Protection Solutions, or WRPS, said employees reported throat and nasal irritation and headaches. But good news, every worker had been checked out and released to return to work. The Hanford On-Site Medical Center, run by another government contractor, deemed every single patient A-OK to get back on the job. That is misleading. We found the situation is far more serious than the feds and its contractors are letting on. All of the employees were not and still are not back to work. And many have symptoms far worse than an irritation.
I felt kind of dizzy, like almost, like I couldn't walk.
It's just like I can't get a good deep breath. It's like a real shallow breath all the time.
Steve Ellingson and Becky Holland are veteran Hanford workers in good standing. When we sat down with them last week, neither was back to work, and both were fighting off serious symptoms.
It was hard for me to get my nose to stop bleeding.
Right before coming to the interview, a doctor cauterized Becky's nose to stop a week's worth of nosebleeds, and Steve spent all of the day before throwing up.
I was coughing so hard that it would start the gag reflex and I was throwing up.
How worried are you?
If you'd asked me this a week ago, I would have said, oh, it's probably going to go away. Now I'm getting worried because this is 2 weeks and it's not better. Yesterday was the worst day I've had. So, I don't know, I'm getting worried that this may be the way I am the rest of my life.
Part of the worry? None of the exposed workers knows exactly what's gotten inside their bodies. They all work in what are called tank farms, right above the underground nuclear waste storage tanks, holding millions of gallons of the deadliest material on the planet. During 4 decades of plutonium production at the site for the country's nuclear weapons program, hundreds of chemicals were used in the process. Lethal substances such as butanol, formaldehyde, mercury, and nitrous oxide. Remember the woman we saw going into the ER? That was Becky Holland, who's worried about all those unknowns since that day.
If you don't know what you're exposed to, you don't know, what you can expect in the future. What kind of, I have these symptoms today, what am I going to have tomorrow? Or what am I going to have in 5 years?
Well, the WRPS president, Dave Olson, has assured the workers, your safety is my primary concern as we cope with these events. Not everyone is buying it.
The lack of concern is discouraging to me.
Once out of the hospital, Becky Holland visited that clinic run by the company HPMC. After listing off her symptoms, nosebleeds, intense headaches, sweats, and shaking, what did the HPMC provider do? Handed over a pain reliever, a cough drop, and a clearance to return to work.
I was offended. Almost like, you're making all this up. Here's some Tylenol and a throat lozenge. Now get to work.
And as Steve Ellingson deals with burning lungs and nonstop coughing,
I'm sorry,
using inhalers and narcotics to cope, HPMC gave him an official cleared to work document, but he hasn't gotten much more from his company or the federal government.
Has anyone from the federal government called and asked, how are you doing, Steve?
No one. None.
All of the exposed workers we've talked to are waiting for answers. What toxins did they inhale? What's in store for their health? In the meantime, these two have taken an unusual step. With Hanford's long-standing culture of secrecy and documented retaliation, few speak out. But with 50 years of experience between them, Steve Ellingson and Becky Holland say the time for change is now.
I think that the truth should be the truth. I don't think you should tell people that everybody's fine. They're all back to work, it's all okay. That place has got some dangerous stuff. And if other people, if it's going to save people by us saying something, I'd sure like to see people get, a better deal. I know I don't want to be like this.
What have they done to you?
Essentially ruined my life. They've literally destroyed me.
Lonnie Poteet worked at Hanford for 12 years, and during that time, less than 1 hour on the job changed his life forever.
Half hour, 45 minutes, you're breathing in some of the most toxic substances on the planet.
Correct. The wind was carrying it right to me.
In 2007, this hose on the left of your screen ruptured, spilling 85 gallons of radioactively contaminated chemicals onto the ground. Crews were evacuated, but hours later, Lonnie Poteet showed up for work, completely unaware of the hazard. No one called to say, stay away.
They knew I was coming to that pump. They knew it had malfunctioned. Why didn't they tell me?
Once a standout football star, coach, and outdoorsman, Poteet can't do any of that anymore.
I get these cancer growths on my head every now and then.
The Department of Energy has admitted inhaling those unknown chemical vapors directly caused Lonnie Poteet's health problems, the worst of which is something called trigeminal neuralgia, a degenerative disease that suddenly and repeatedly shoots electric-like bolts through the face. It's considered one of the most painful conditions known to man.
Do you have any idea what...
Go ahead.
Was that a bad one?
Yeah.
During our interview, we witnessed the pain hit Lonnie several times.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on, it sounds like this is
Go ahead.
what's happening right now.
I get these shots of pain. It's just daily living.
And how bad can that be?
Sometimes I'm just, whatever you want to call it, I'm down for the day. I have to lay in the room and stay in the dark. And sometimes it's all day.
He isn't alone. We've met many Hanford workers with diseases caused by chemical vapors at the site. Don Slaw's breathing problems are so serious, he's on 4 liters of oxygen a night. Diana Gegg is permanently disabled with brain damage and vision loss. Ed Bricker suffers from lung disease and skin cancers. At the beginning, none of them questioned their safety on the job. They'd been told, "We've got your back" at Hanford.
Yeah, that's the first thing they feed you, is that it's safety first.
10 years before Poteet's accident, this Department of Energy study, the Hewitt Report, brought the workforce good news. It showed the vapor risk to workers does not exist. Chemical releases from the tanks are well below OSHA levels, and in most cases, respiratory protection isn't necessary. But we found at the exact same time this report came out, assuring the workers that all was well at the Hanford tank farms, the U.S. Department of Energy was conducting its own research at this lab in Richland. Their study found something very different, that the chemical vapors were extremely dangerous for the workers. This report showed that yes, most vapor exposures do not exceed OSHA regulation, but that doesn't matter. Tank farm workers are at great risk of getting cancer and other chronic diseases from chemical vapors, and it's unclear whether cancer is induced after chronic exposure or perhaps after a single release.
I was never told of anything like that.
And as you can see,
We showed Poteet the study which scientists at the Pacific Northwest National Lab finished a decade before his exposure. He said he would have insisted on wearing a respirator or air tank if he would have known.
I sure wished I'd have had this, because it would make a difference, and it really upsets a person to know that they could have done more to protect you, but you're just a number to them, and they run you through and they'll hire another guy right behind me.
We found the Department of Energy didn't make the report public, share the results with workers, or with the federally chartered Hanford Advisory Board. It's their job to consider science and make recommendations to help keep workers safe.
are you saying you never saw this report?
No, I didn't see that report.
And should you have?
Absolutely.
Dr. Tim Tuccaro is a renowned toxicologist and medical doctor who served on the advisory board's Health and Safety Committee when the scientists came up with the findings.
It's very upsetting as an occupational medicine physician and public health practitioner that an opportunity for better protecting workers at Hanford was missed, apparently.
But I believe that we have to solve the vapor issue.
At a public meeting in Richland last month, the head of the Department of Energy at Hanford, Kevin Smith, acknowledged the potential hazards from chemical vapors.
We know that some vapors are very harmful. Some vapors can cause health issues. Some vapors can cause death. So the answer is some vapors can do that.
Yet those in charge at Hanford in the mid-90s weren't admitting that and weren't sharing information that could have spared sick workers like Lonnie Poteet.
They've taken my life and screwed it up. How much they've shortened it, I don't know. I feel really betrayed. They lied to me.
We're in Washington, D.C. tonight to speak with our congressional leaders and experts about this unfair system. We've met one Hanford worker after another who doctors say got sick from their work at the site, yet the federal government takes a different approach, to deny them over and over when they reach out for help.
He was such a special person. Everybody loved him.
Gary Sal was a family man, fisherman, and outgoing life of the party. His wife Barb says he was also one of those people who couldn't wait to get out the door for work.
Right now, he would be your very best friend, because within 5 minutes you fell in love with him and he fell in love with you. It happened all the time.
For 28 years, Gary Sal charged off to Hanford for work as a carpenter, working lots of jobs in what's called the tank farms. That's where the U.S. Department of Energy stores millions of gallons of cancer-causing nuclear byproducts in aging underground tanks. A toxic legacy from the bomb-making era, inherited by new generations to clean up. And as the waste breaks down in those tanks, they often release poisonous chemical vapors into the air, where workers, like carpenters, can inhale them.
We thought we were safe. We thought, you know, they knew what they were doing. But they don't have a clue.
About 10 years ago, Gary Sal started forgetting things, and his brain function got worse and worse. Within 5 years, he couldn't work, could barely speak, hallucinated, and operated on the level of a 4-year-old. Doctors at Harborview diagnosed him with work-related toxic encephalopathy, a degenerative brain disorder. The cause, according to the experts, breathing in those chemicals at Hanford.
You totally lose everything you ever had. Your memories, your mind, your thought process, everything's gone. It's just a shell.
Barb documented that suffering in a difficult-to-watch video taken in 2011. That once upbeat, athletic, skilled craftsman, now in a hospital bed, trembling and frightened.
Yes?
On a feeding tube.
I'm right here.
Come on.
I'm right here.
No. No. You ain't coming around. No.
No?
No.
What's wrong?
I don't want him in here.
You don't want him in here?
No.
Okay. Okay. Nobody's gonna come in here.
It got to where no one should ever see their loved one go through what he went through. It got very, very bad.
Originally, the federal officials whose job it is to help sick Hanford workers like Gary disagreed with his doctors. The Department of Energy's insurer wrote that not Hanford, but alcohol consumption or a B12 deficiency could be making him sick. Barb Sal battled for over a year before the feds admitted that yes, exposure to heavy metals and chemicals at the site damaged his brain. She says that's an example of the callous way Hanford workers are treated once they get sick.
They get rid of you. You're no good anymore. We've used you to the extent we can. They don't think that we're people out there, that we have families that care about us, and it's just go in, get the job done at all costs.
We found this is standard protocol at Hanford, where the workers' compensation program isn't run by our state's L&I, but by the Department of Energy itself. They're self-insured. A government study in 2004 showed twice as many Hanford workers are denied claims compared with the state average.
Undescribable what they've done to my family. They don't care. They don't even know we exist. But something's got to be done.
The problems were too big.
This is the man who says he'll do just that. Kevin Smith's been the top federal official at Hanford for a year and a half. He says he's just now hearing about these cases and pledges to find answers.
If a worker is impacted, that came here and did national security work for the good of the nation in the Cold War, they ought to be treated appropriately. And we'll chase that and see what the problem is and where we might have a disconnect.
But people like Barb Sal want to know, where were the managers before? And what about the other Washington, where it appears the Department of Energy has set up a system for the little guy to fail?
Washington, D.C. is like just turning their back on the fact that Hanford exists, that it is as contaminated as it is, and that it is killing people.
Working at Hanford did kill Gary Sal. He died 3 years ago at the age of 57.
I miss everything about him. Everything. On a daily basis. I just want him back.
When Washington state workers began producing plutonium in the 40s, less than 1% of the workforce had any idea what they were making. It was that secret at Hanford, codename Site W by the U.S. government. In 1945, this government video revealed the truth.
Our nation possessed the ingredients for the most powerful weapons ever conceived, and the secret was out.
But the cult of secrecy continued. For national security, Congress gave the Department of Energy the power to oversee itself during the Cold War, including its health and safety program, a policy that, 25 years later, is still around today.
We are not waging the Cold War anymore.
Bob Alvarez is a former presidential advisor, one of the top nuclear policy experts in the world. He says the recent sick workers are the latest casualties of that culture of mystery. Vapors causing serious illnesses at Hanford isn't new. The incidents go back 30 years. Yet at Hanford, the most contaminated workplace in the nation, OSHA can't get past the gates to investigate, order changes like making respirators mandatory, or issue fines. Safeguards that are routine at every other job site in the state.
Isolation, secrecy, privilege, lack of accountability. All these things are hallmarks of the Cold War and are still alive and well in the Department of Energy.
It has turned my life upside down. I am no longer the person I used to be 7 years ago.
Diana Gegg didn't used to need these canes to get around the house or take a load of medications to make it through the day.
Well, I take these two are for my dementia.
For 20 years, she was a heavy equipment operator at Hanford and loved it until everything changed in 2007. She was working a bulldozer above some of the underground nuclear storage tanks, where scientists have documented more than 1,200 radioactively contaminated chemicals in the nuclear waste.
I kept smelling this chlorine ammonia type smell.
On that day in 2007, some of that waste spilled onto the ground, and Gegg, without a respirator, inhaled chemical vapors for a few hours before an alarm went off.
This was like having the rug jerked out from underneath me. Seriously.
She's left with brain damage, sudden tremors, vision loss, and dementia. Illnesses the government admits were caused by that exposure.
It gets really bad sometimes.
During our interview, her right leg and arm trembled on and off.
It's like being in a bad accident and having a brain injury and you're not there anymore. It's sad.
She can no longer go outside without a wheelchair, cook, or drive.
I feel like I've fought a Cold War and the government's left me behind.
The former construction crew leader, archery champ, grandmother full of energy and ideas, today fights to remember the basics. At this point in the interview, she was describing her daily medications.
The Celebrex is for my
King 5 has uncovered a slew of expert reports saying the Department of Energy needs to get out of the business of policing itself. In 1995, the department's own advisory committee found self-regulation has failed, and a subsequent working group of senior managers recommended safety and health should be externally regulated by a group such as OSHA. In 1992, the former head of OSHA wrote, Hanford's failure to solve chemical vapor problems would be viewed by OSHA as willful violations of law and subject to possible criminal penalties. 25 years worth of advice and the same old no consequence, no penalty process is still in place.
And I'm going, really? What? They said they were going to take care of it back then. You know, that we can figure out how to deal with these problems, and they're not. It's not any different than it ever was.
With the Department of Energy calling its own safety shots, critics say they've got a pass to ignore repeat recommendations, like installing what are called scrubbers, technology meant to capture the chemical gases before they vent into the open air.
We got to have some change here, and what that means is there needs to be an enforcement regime that makes them do things.
Hanford expert Tom Carpenter helped author a 2010 study urging the Department of Energy to invest in the equipment.
It's simple technology. It's not rocket science. Again, a lot of chemical sites use these things, but not at Hanford. They're just deemed too expensive, and they just said no, out of hand. They're not going to do it.
As for the U.S. Department of Energy, they say they're considering that technology and more, and that they aren't pursuing OSHA oversight because their regulations are better, more protective of worker health and safety than OSHA's. They also tell King their safety performance is better than comparable industry performance.
People are still being affected. Obviously, they're not doing enough to prevent it.
For sick workers like Diana Gegg, those government assurances don't mean much. She's 100% disabled and won't ever work again.
I am angry about it.
How many of you believe that you or your loved one got sick from working at Hanford?
I did.
All these people belong to a club they never wanted to join. They've either lost a loved one or are extremely sick after working at Hanford, exposed to toxic chemicals, heavy metals, and solvents at the most contaminated work site in America.
When you've gotten sick, how many of you feel like the government kind of turned its back on you?
I do.
Roger Ibarra and Dick Simonis on the right both have a degenerative lung disease that causes emphysema called COPD. Ron Stevens has that and more.
I've got kidney failure. I've got cancer.
I'm in remission for stage 4 throat cancer and COPD.
Scott Passage's COPD is so advanced, he's coping with just 28% lung capacity.
I'm supposed to be on oxygen 24/7.
Dale Gear worked in the Hanford tank farms for 26 years, where he says the safety teams told him he was protected from metals like mercury and lead. Now he's sick with COPD and brain damage.
How'd you like to breathe that crap in and safety says everything's okay?
I lost my stomach about 1.5 years ago to cancer.
At 49, Terry Wattenberger is constantly in and out of the hospital with COPD, 2 types of cancer, and a muscle disease. 2 years ago, he appeared healthy with a full light in front of him. Since then, he's lost 70 pounds and is struggling to hang on.
So you feel like working there is going to end your life?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's hard. Yeah.
Being sick isn't the only thing this group has in common. Each one has applied for financial help through a U.S. Department of Labor program. It was set up 15 years ago specifically for sick workers who did the secret and dangerous nuclear defense work for the country throughout the Cold War and the ongoing cleanup. But after applying, they all found themselves fighting.
And I fought and I fought and I fought them, and it's a losing battle.
The Department of Labor accepts that the workers in our group interview were exposed to toxins like arsenic, ammonia, asbestos, and cadmium, a metal with radioactive isotopes. But doctors hired by Department of Labor contractors found working at Hanford was not a significant factor in causing, contributing to, or even aggravating their illnesses.
How many of you have been denied once by the Department of Labor?
I have.
Twice?
I have.
3 times?
I have.
This report, commissioned by Congress in 2010, lays out some of the problems with the program. Investigators found there's no oversight of the consultant physicians who have recommended the denials. These are doctors hired by Department of Labor paid contractors to review medical files. They never actually see the patients. The department declined to be interviewed on camera, but sent a statement to say consulting doctors are used not to hurt, but actually to help claimants who may not be able to meet their burden of proof. That's not the way these people see it.
I just think that we're all getting a raw deal. And I don't know why, but they take they follow somebody that really don't know me, that don't know any of us, and is going to stamp a reject on your form.
The congressional investigation also found processing claims can take between a few months to more than 7 years. 7 years. Many sick workers don't have that long, as the medical bills pile up.
I mean, they're running and hiding and denying and denying and denying. And they don't care, and all this money's come out of my pocket. I mean, that's what's irritating me bad.
I could die in 6 months. My lungs are going that fast, and I worry about my wife. That's all.
Because you want her to be taken care of.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. We got bills coming in right now.
These workers and survivors of lost loved ones say the system is so cumbersome, so lacking in compassion, that they believe the government is simply waiting them out to save money.
How many of you feel as though the government is waiting for you to die?
Absolutely.
They can outwait, outlast, and outspend any of the workers that I've seen.
Dr. Brian Campbell is a neuropsychologist in Spokane who's evaluated dozens of Hanford workers.
It's very difficult, in my opinion, for the worker to pass that denial threshold.
Of Dr. Campbell's patients, the case of Dale Gear is perhaps the best example of that. Remember, he has lung disease and brain damage. It took Gear 5 years to get the Department of Labor to help him with his COPD. Now he has an in-home nurse once a week to manage that lung disease, along with boxes of drugs and nebulizer treatments.
I'm sick every day. I hurt from the time I get up until the time I go to bed.
Doctors across the country have found working at Hanford most likely caused Gear's illnesses, including his brain damage. One went so far as to say there is no other plausible explanation for the heavy metals in his system, toxins that cause dementia.
And after this letter was written?
He was denied. What more does a person need to do than clearly state that the workers' exposure at Hanford led to the problems described?
The group tells us no one's looking to get rich. They want their medical needs taken care of. And for those already gone, their survivors want to pay the bills left behind, what they thought the U.S. government agreed to when they went to work at Hanford.
They promised if we did get sick, they'd take care of us. And now they kind of just, okay, you know, you don't count now because you're out of the mix. You're not labor no more. You're not in the union. You're on your own. And this ain't right.
In Pasco, Susanna Frame, King 5 News.
Just ain't right.
This is King 5 News.
The time for study's over. It is now time to act.
Now at 6:30, a milestone announcement. For the first time in history, the state of Washington is taking legal action against the federal government for failing to protect workers at the Hanford nuclear site.
The milestone announcement comes after a series of reports from the King 5 investigators. The stories expose that workers are in harm's way at the site, and the federal government, which owns Hanford, isn't doing enough to protect them.
Susanna Frame has been investigating this issue for the last 6 months and has more on today's announcement.
I'm sending this notice of endangerment and intent to sue today to get workers the protection they need and deserve from hazardous tank vapors.
And with that, Attorney General Bob Ferguson took a legal first for the state. While the AG's office has sued Hanford before for missing deadlines on the nuclear waste cleanup, the state has never stood up in the legal arena for the workers.
It is not acceptable for the federal government to expose workers in the state of Washington to known health dangers. I won't accept it.
Since March, at least 54 people have gone to the hospital or doctor after inhaling unknown chemical vapors on the job. The toxic gases vent without warning from underground tanks. Over the last 20-plus years, one study after another has shown at Hanford they're not protecting workers from these vapors, known hazards, and experts, including scientists from the Department of Energy itself, have suggested fixes. Yet little's changed, and people are still getting sick.
Whatever we end up with, it cannot be another report that sits on a shelf and doesn't get the job done for worker safety. That's not acceptable. I want to be clear about that. The report, and this is non-negotiable from my standpoint, will be legally enforceable.